Good afternoon, bienvenue, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Welcome to PPF Rebuild Canada Growth Summit to another wonderful session. Je suis Yolande James, Yolande James. Je suis très heureuse de pouvoir animer encore une autre session sans doute extraordinaire, le sommet sur la croissance, rebâtir le Canada par les politiques publiques, le Forum des politiques publiques. Of course, I would like to begin by a virtual land acknowledgement. Typically, we would be hosting this event in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. However, if we could all just take a moment wherever you are to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Indigenous people and to have them in your thoughts as we extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for their valuable past and present contributions to this land that we call Canada. So today's session would not at all be possible, of course, without our partners. So let me begin by thanking our lead partners, CIBC, as well as Microsoft, our supporting partners, the Business Development Bank of Canada, Bell, Bespoke, Canadian Bankers Association, the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, the Canada Pension Plan Investments, Deloitte, the National Public Relations, and the Globe and Mail. So in our last session, as you all saw, we had this wonderful session with the Northern innovators who were not only great leaders and ambassadors to the North, whether it be in supporting Indigenous communities in their transition to the South, mental health resources, entrepreneurship. We really got, I would say, a lesson. We were schooled in what it means to live and work with purpose and change things on the ground and in your communities. So we're really, really excited for that. And today we will have, I am no doubt, not a wonderful, amazing conversation on an issue that we have been talking about for a while and that I think will continue to be not only relevant, but really important for us as we move forward. That is Canada-US relations, and we have 60 minutes for this session. So without further ado, I have really the honor of introducing our speakers for this Fireside chat. First, Her Excellency Kirsten Hillman, who was appointed Canada's ambassador to the United States of America in Washington, D.C. in March of this year. She served as Canada's acting ambassador to the U.S. from August of 2019 until her nomination. Prior to that, she served as deputy ambassador in Washington from August 2017 until August 2019, before joining the Embassy of Canada to the United States of America. Ms. Hillman held the position of Assistant Deputy Minister of the Trade Agreements and Negotiations Branch of Global Affairs Canada, overseeing all of Canada's trade policy and trade negotiations. Drew Fagan, who will be moderating the discussion with Her Excellency, is a PPF Fellow and Professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs at and Public Policy in the University of Toronto. He previously worked in senior positions at the federal and provincial level, including as Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy and Planning at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now Global Affairs, Canada. Before his public service career, Drew worked at the Globe and Mail, where he held numerous senior positions, including a Washington correspondent. So before I hand things over to Drew, let me remind you that a little bit later on in the conversation, I'll be happy to relay any questions that you may have and comments. So we strongly encourage you to participate, and you can do that through the chat function on FeedLoop. So I'll be reading you there and see you in a moment. On that note, to you, Drew Fagan.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure, Ambassador. Welcome, bienvenue. Glad to have you here. Let me just start off with it's interesting times, unprecedented circumstance in terms of this transition as it continues, but there clearly is a president-elect. Policies will change, and we'll get to some of the key specifics, but at the same time, I think there's an expectation that some degree of America first, even if that's not the moniker that continues to be used, is going to continue. Let me ask you just off the top, what does this mean for Canada-US relations and Canadian priorities with the United States?
Thanks, Drew, and thanks for having me. Merci, Yolande. Bonjour à tout le monde. Yeah, so super question. And, you know, I think first, obviously it goes without saying that my job as ambassador and our job as government officials representing our country is to represent the country regardless of who is inhabiting the White House or the Senate or the House of Representatives. And ultimately, and this is, I think it's really important to emphasize, ultimately Canadian priorities with respect to the Canada-US relationship derive from Canada and what it is that's most important to Canadians at any one particular point in time. And so when there are changes in the White House, when there's changes in the leadership in Congress, there may be some shifts in our ability to cooperate on some of the Canadian priorities with certain players versus others, but they don't affect our priorities per se. And so right now, Canada's priorities, job one, probably job 2, 3, and 4, is fighting the COVID pandemic. And in fighting the COVID pandemic, also making sure that we are putting in place the necessary supports for getting people through that from an economic and security perspective and getting us on the road to economic recovery. Those are the Canadian core priorities right now, and those are the priorities that have been quite central to the way in which we've been dealing with the Trump administration and in these early days of dealing with the Biden incoming team. Of course, there are other things as well in and around that, like everything that has to do with supply chain resilience, whether it's for PPEs or food or our energy relationship or our national security relationship, all those things, of course, persist. But when we think about what is critical and crucial and number one right now, it's fighting the pandemic and economic security. And if you look at the Biden team coming in, the president-elect has 4 clear priorities that he's articulated: COVID, fighting COVID, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. So there's a lot of potential cooperation there. And of course, like us, he has many other priorities, but if you look at those 4, there's an awful lot of room for cooperation with our government because we have a lot of things in common.
That's great. And we'll get into many of those, so thank you. Off the top, though, I want to ask you about the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President-elect. When he was Vice President, had a visit to Ottawa in December 2016. You can see some of the video on YouTube, I remember. They know each other. Going back, I think they had the first bilateral call after the election, I believe. What did they discuss, and how much do those personal relationships matter? Not just, I guess, with regard to the leaders at the top, but potential members of cabinet, some of whom know Canada well.
Yeah. So relationships absolutely matter. It doesn't mean you can't do business if relationships aren't, strong and warm and personal, but having strong, warm, personal relationships absolutely helps. It's an accelerator. It's a door opener. And as you say, the Prime Minister and the President-elect know each other well. They worked together when he was Vice President Biden. We have strong ties into many people in the Biden team because they were in the Obama White House. So throughout the federal system, there are a lot of people there that we know. And of course, the president-elect also has a long history in the Senate. So even before he was vice president, he was well known to us and had a very strong and warm feeling towards Canada. So those are really important features, these personal ties and an affinity to the country. It was the first call he made. In fact, it was the only call he made on his sort of second day, and then he started making his other calls to international leaders the next day, which is For someone like me, it's very gratifying because I do believe it to be a signal of his warmth and affection for the Prime Minister. They talked about COVID. I mean, I'll be honest. After the Prime Minister congratulated the President-elect and his team and the Vice President-elect, they talked a lot about COVID because that is number one issue on Mr. Biden's mind. And in fact, he started rolling out his plans with respect to COVID the first minute of the first day when he was declared the winner. So they talked about that. They talked about the economy. They talked about jobs. They talked about supporting communities. They talked about cooperation in the area of energy and energy security. They talked about climate change. They talked about Black Lives Matter. They talked about international organizations and the WHO and NATO and a few others. So it was a fairly robust conversation.
Let me ask you about COVID to begin with, their primary topic during that call, and really the top of mind issue for the Biden administration and for Canada right now. I noticed in his victory speech, the president-elect's victory speech, I guess on a week ago, Saturday night, it was really the one issue that he talked about in some detail. And then a couple of days later, he had his task force. The same day, Pfizer announced their plans with regard to the vaccine. So how do you think policy will change, and what can we do most effectively with the United States? And I'm wondering in that context a little bit about the border and the context in which it's closed right now, not to trade, but to people. What are we thinking with regard to that as the top of mind issue?
Yeah, that's a super good, I'm really happy that you referenced the fact about the Vice President-elect's speech. It was very much a speech that was about his plan, how he would approach his presidency. And so there wasn't a lot of policy talk there, with the one exception of COVID. And actually, it's a really good point to make, because that gives us a very clear signal of where his head's at and what he wanted to start to get done immediately. And as it turns out, of course, that is exactly what we're seeing. In terms of cooperation between Canada and the United States, so there's cooperation on things that are international or bilateral, and then there is our own domestic ways in which we manage the virus and we manage domestic affairs. So on that latter point, the first thing I'd like to say is that, for Canada, we have since day one approached our approach to the virus has been based on science, the advice of experts, caution, trying to find the necessary measures that would control the virus so that we could engage in important activities in our lives. And that continues to be the approach. That continues to be the approach in our country, which is science and the advice of experts, and to the greatest extent possible, cooperation and coordination across our country, recognizing that each geography has different, the virus is behaving differently and has different facts on the ground at any one time. In terms of bilateral cooperation, so again, I would say that with the current administration, the Trump administration, we have had actually really good cooperation since the outbreak. And I often think of what has been done in waves, right? The first wave that we had right back in the early days was finding ways to get our citizens home. Everybody remembers that, right? You remember all the people that were on cruise ships and all the people who were trying to get flights home, and not just from the United States, from around the world in some places that weren't very well served by airplanes. And the US and Canada actually were, people perhaps don't really know this because seems like a long time ago now. We put people on each other's planes. We facilitated the transportation of each other's citizens home. The U.S. was incredibly collaborative, getting thousands of Canadians home, thousands and thousands. So that was the first wave. And the second wave, as you allude to, is the management of the border and the restriction of non-discretionary travel. And since then, we have been doing a lot of work on supply chains and making sure that those are working really well, and making sure that they're continuing to flow as they need to for food and PPEs and medical equipment. And we're also cooperating and coordinating, of course, on the science around vaccinations and treatments, and also plans to sort of distribute this internationally. So the cooperation is actually very deep and very effective from my perspective. In a change of administration, I think first and foremost, I absolutely hope and have no reason to believe that we won't have the same level of coordination and cooperation. In terms of decisions that we'll make as to how to manage our border, I would hope that we'll be able to maintain this fairly coordinated approach with the United States. Perhaps we will. I hope we will. We each make our own decisions with respect to our border, but we've tried to stay coordinated. But ultimately, you know, Canada's decisions are going to be based on the science and the experts and the facts on the ground. And my sense is that we will continue to be very cautious about how we manage the border until we're sure that we have this pandemic more under control.